The 911 call came in at 8:52 p.m. on November 13, 2016. The dispatcher's screen lighting up with an address in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, a quiet suburb about 10 miles southeast of St. Paul. The voice on the other end belonged to Amy Allwine, and even through the recording you could hear what sounded like panic, like grief, like a man whose world had just collapsed. "My wife," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "I just got home and I found my wife. There's blood. I think she shot herself. Please, you have to send someone." The dispatcher, trained to remain calm in moments of chaos, asked the standard questions. Was she breathing? Had he touched anything? Where was the gun? Stephen's answers came in fragments, disjointed and breathless. He'd just returned home from picking up their son from his Sunday evening youth group activity. He'd walked into the house and found Amy in their bedroom. There was so much blood. The gun was on the bed near her hand. He didn't know what to do. The dispatcher kept him on the line while patrol units were dispatched, their sirens cutting through the cold November night as they raced toward the Allwine home on Quinlan Avenue. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. When Dakota County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the split-level home just after 9 p.m., they found Stephen Allwine standing in the driveway, his face pale in the glow of the porch light, his hands shaking. He looked like a man in shock, like someone who just witnessed something incomprehensible. He led them inside, through the main level and down the hallway to the master bedroom, and that's where they found her. Amy Allwine, 43 years old, lay on the bed fully clothed in the casual outfit she'd worn to church that morning. A single gunshot wound to the head, a Ruger 9mm handgun resting on the bed near her right hand, blood soaked into the comforter beneath her. The scene had all the initial markers of a suicide, the kind of tragedy that happens behind closed doors in quiet neighborhoods, the kind of thing that makes people whisper about depression and hidden pain and how you never really know what someone is going through. But even in those first moments, as deputies secured the scene and called for the medical examiner, something felt wrong, small details that didn't quite line up, a staging that seemed just a little too neat. The way Stephen's story had subtle inconsistencies that experienced investigators learned to notice. What looked like the tragic end to a Sunday evening would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister. Amy Allwine hadn't taken her own life. She'd been murdered, and the evidence would lead investigators into the darkest corners of the internet, exposing a plot so calculated and cold-blooded that it would shock a community and make national headlines. The man crying in the driveway, the devoted husband who'd called 911 in apparent desperation, had orchestrated his wife's death with a level of premeditation that bordered on obsessive. He'd tried to hire a hitman on the dark web. When that failed, he'd done it himself, staging the scene to look like suicide while their son was at church. And he almost got away with it. Amy Renee Carlson had been born in 1973 and grew up in the kind of tight-knit Minnesota family where Sunday dinners were sacred and faith was woven into the fabric of daily life. She was the middle child, bookended by siblings who would later describe her as the glue that held their family together, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and organized the holiday gatherings and made sure no one felt left out. She had a natural warmth that drew people to her, an authenticity that made you feel like you mattered, like your stories and struggles were worth her time and attention. Friends from her high school years in the Twin Cities area remembered her as studious, but not stuck up, religious, but not judgmental. The kind of person who could navigate different social circles with ease, because she genuinely liked people, and people genuinely liked her back. She excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, and developed an early interest in computers that was unusual for girls of her generation, a passion that would eventually lead her to a successful career in information technology. After graduating from high school, Amy attended college and earned her degree in computer science, entering a field that was overwhelmingly male-dominated in the mid-90s. She worked her way up through various IT positions, eventually landing a job at a financial services company where her meticulous attention to detail and problem-solving skills made her an invaluable asset. Colleagues would later tell investigators that Amy was the person you wanted on your team when something went wrong, the one who stayed late to solve the crisis, who explained complex technical issues in ways non-technical people could understand, who never made you feel stupid for asking questions. She was competent without being arrogant, a rare combination in the tech world. But work was just one part of Amy's identity. Her faith was central to everything she did, a guiding principle that informed her decisions and shaped her worldview. She was an active member of the United Brethren Church, a small Christian denomination with conservative values and a strong emphasis on missionary work and community service. It was through church activities that she met Stephen Allwine in the late 90s. Stephen was a few years older, also deeply involved in church leadership, serving as an elder and teaching Bible study classes. He worked as a fitness trainer and had a clean-cut, all-American appearance that matched his role as a spiritual leader in their congregation. To everyone who knew them, Stephen and Amy seemed perfectly matched, two devout Christians who shared the same values and vision for their lives. They married in the early 2000s, a ceremony held in their church with reception in the fellowship hall, their vows spoken before God and their community, promising to love and cherish each other until death do them part. The early years of their marriage were marked by mission work and service. Stephen and Amy traveled together on church mission trips, spending time in developing countries doing humanitarian work, teaching, building, serving. They talked about having children, about raising a family grounded in faith and service. When biological children didn't come easily, they turned to adoption, a process that would consume several years of their lives and test their patience and faith. They navigated the complex adoption system, attended classes, filled out endless paperwork, underwent home studies, and waited. The waiting was the hardest part, Amy confided to friends, not knowing when or if they'd finally become parents, feeling like their family was incomplete. But in the mid-2000s, their waiting ended. They adopted a son, bringing home the child they prayed for, and their family felt complete. Amy threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else. She read parenting books, attended school events, volunteered in her son's classroom, organized playdates, made sure he was involved in church youth activities. She wanted him to have the kind of childhood she'd had, stable and loving and filled with community. To their neighbors on Quinlan Avenue, the Allwines were the epitome of the perfect family. Their house was well maintained, their lawn neatly trimmed, their holiday decorations tasteful. Stephen could often be seen in the driveway washing his car or shooting basketball with his son. Amy tended a small garden in the summer and hung seasonal wreaths on their front door. They waved to neighbors, attended community events, seemed happy. At church, they were even more visible. Stephen continued his work as an elder, leading prayers and organizing men's groups. Amy helped coordinate the women's ministry and volunteered in the children's programs. They sat together in services, their son between them, and seemed to embody the kind of Christian marriage the church held up as an ideal. When people in the congregation faced struggles, Stephen and Amy were often the ones who showed up with meals, with offers to help, with prayers and practical support. But underneath this picture-perfect exterior, cracks had been forming for years, invisible to almost everyone who knew them. Stephen Allwine was living a double life, maintaining his image as a devoted husband and church elder while secretly engaging in behaviors that would have horrified his community if they'd known. He'd been having an affair, conducting a relationship with another woman while coming home to Amy every night, while sitting beside her in church every Sunday, while leading Bible studies about faithfulness and integrity. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this deception was staggering. But Stephen managed it with a compartmentalization that suggested something deeper and darker than simple marital infidelity. He wanted out of his marriage, wanted to be with his mistress, but he also wanted to maintain his reputation, his standing in the church, his image as a good Christian man. Divorce would damage that image, would raise questions, would make him the subject of gossip and judgment. He'd lose credibility as a church elder. People would take sides. His carefully constructed life would crumble. So Stephen began considering another option, one so extreme and evil that most people couldn't imagine even entertaining the thought. He started researching how to have someone killed. In the summer of 2016, roughly 5 months before that November night when he'd called 911 in apparent distress, Stephen Allwine entered the dark web, that hidden portion of the internet accessible only through special browsers like Tor, where anonymity reigns and illegal activities flourish. He found his way to a site called Besa Mafia, which advertised itself as a murder-for-hire service. claiming to have connections to Albanian organized crime. The site looked professional, almost corporate, with customer service representatives and Bitcoin payment systems and even user reviews. It presented murder as a transaction, something you could order as easily as buying something from any e-commerce site, just with cryptocurrency instead of credit cards. Stephen created an account using the username DogDayGod and began the process of trying to hire someone to kill his wife. The communications he sent through Bessa Mafia were chilling in their detail and calculation. He provided Amy's name, her photo, her work address, her daily routine. He described when she'd be most vulnerable, what time she left for work, where she parked her car. He suggested methods, scenarios that would look like accidents or random violence. He transferred Bitcoin payments, thousands of dollars worth, as deposits, and then additional payments to move his order up the queue. He checked the site obsessively, waiting for updates, asking when the job would be completed. And he did all of this while continuing to live with Amy, to sleep in the same bed, to sit across from her at dinner, to attend church services with her. The compartmentalization was complete. The betrayal was total. What Stephen didn't know, what none of the people trying to use Bessa Mafia knew, was that it was likely a scam. A site designed to extract Bitcoin from would-be murderers with no intention of actually killing anyone. But even if it was a scam, Stephen's intent was clear and documented. He wanted his wife dead. He was willing to pay to make it happen. And when the hitman he'd paid for never materialized, when weeks went by and Amy remained alive and oblivious to the danger her own husband had tried to place her in, Stephen made a decision that would seal his fate. If no one else would kill Amy, he'd do it himself. He bought a Ruger 9mm handgun. He researched how to stage a suicide scene. He acquired scopolamine, a drug that can incapacitate victims and cause confusion and memory loss, something that could help ensure Amy couldn't fight back or understand what was happening to her. He waited for the right opportunity, the right timing, the right moment when he'd have an alibi and their son would be out of the house. That moment came on Sunday, November 13th, 2016. It was an ordinary day, at least on the surface. The Allwines attended church services that morning as they did every Sunday. Amy wore a casual sweater and jeans, comfortable clothes for a day of worship and fellowship. Stephen participated in the service as an elder, possibly even leading prayers or reading scripture, playing his role perfectly. Their son attended Sunday school and then youth group activities planned for that evening. Amy and Stephen returned home after the morning service, and sometime that afternoon, in the quiet privacy of their home, Stephen Allwine murdered his wife. He may have used the scopolamine to incapacitate her first, ensuring she couldn't fight effectively. He shot her once in the head with a Ruger he purchased. He placed the gun near her hand to suggest she pulled the trigger herself. He arranged the scene, wiping down surfaces, creating the narrative he'd need to sell to first responders. And then he left the house, drove to the church to pick up his son from youth group, and returned home to discover his wife's body, placing that frantic call to 911 that would start an investigation he never anticipated. The deputies standing in the Allwine bedroom that November night saw what Stephen wanted them to see: a suicide scene, a tragedy, a wife who'd succumbed to some private despair. But even in those first hours, questions were forming. Why would Amy, who had plans for the coming week, who'd seemed fine at church that morning, who had a son she adored, suddenly take her own life? Where was the note? Why was there so little blood spatter on Stephen if he'd found her immediately? Why did his timeline feel slightly off? These questions would multiply in the days ahead as investigators dug deeper, as forensic evidence contradicted the suicide narrative, as Amy's digital life was examined and Stephen's secrets began to surface. The perfect life, the perfect marriage, the perfect Christian family was about to be exposed as a carefully maintained illusion, and the man crying in the driveway would be revealed as something far more terrifying than anyone in Cottage Grove, Minnesota could have imagined. The case of Amy Allwine was just beginning, and where it would lead would shock a community and expose the darkness that can hide behind even the most trusted, most righteous-seeming facades. The morning after Amy Allwine's death, Dakota County detectives returned to the split-level house on Quinlan Avenue with a different lens, a sharper focus, and a growing list of inconsistencies that wouldn't let them rest. Detective Ryan McAleer had worked homicides for 12 years, and he'd learned to trust his gut when something felt wrong. The scene from the night before kept replaying in his mind, small details nagging at him like splinters he couldn't quite remove. The angle of the gunshot wound, the pristine state of Stephen's clothing despite his claim that he'd checked Amy's pulse and tried to help her, the lack of powder residue and the expected patterns, the way the gun had been positioned just a little too perfectly near Amy's hand, as if someone had placed it there rather than it falling naturally from her grip. McCallum had seen real suicides, dozens of them, and they were messy and chaotic and rarely looked like movie scenes. This looked staged, and that single observation would become the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything Stephen Allwine had tried so carefully to construct. The medical examiner's preliminary findings only deepened the suspicions. Dr. Tecumseh, Michael McGee, who performed thousands of autopsies during his career with the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office, noted several irregularities in his initial assessment. The trajectory of the bullet didn't align with a self-inflicted wound from the angle and position Amy's body had been found. The contact wound characteristics were inconsistent with someone holding a gun to their own head. There was stippling and powder residue, but the pattern suggested the gun had been held by someone else, fired from a slightly different angle than would be natural for suicide. More disturbing was the toxicology screening that would take several days to complete, but would eventually reveal something that transformed the investigation entirely. Amy's blood contained scopolamine, a powerful drug derived from plants in the nightshade family, sometimes called devil's breath in certain parts of the world where it's used by criminals to incapacitate victims. It's not a drug you accidentally ingest. It's not prescribed for common ailments. Its presence in Amy's system meant someone had deliberately drugged her, likely to make her compliant, confused, unable to fight back effectively. This wasn't suicide. This was murder, carefully planned and coldly executed. Detective McAleer brought Stephen Allwine in for a follow-up interview 3 days after Amy's death, and this time the conversation had a different tone. They met at the Dakota County Sheriff's Office in a small interview room with recording equipment and two-way mirrors, the kind of space where truth and lies are sorted out under fluorescent lights. Stephen arrived wearing the demeanor of a grieving husband, his eyes red-rimmed, his movements slow and heavy as if weighted down by sorrow. He answered questions about his marriage, about Amy's mental state, about the events of that Sunday. He maintained that Amy had been fine, maybe a little stressed about work, but nothing unusual, nothing that would suggest she was contemplating suicide. He stuck to his timeline, the church service, coming home, leaving again to pick up their son, returning to find the horror in their bedroom. But as McAleer pressed deeper, asking Stephen to walk through the details again and again, small contradictions began appearing. Times that didn't quite match up, movements that seemed unnecessary, explanations that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Stephen grew more defensive, more careful with his words, and McAleer recognized the shift, that moment when someone realizes the conversation has moved from supportive to adversarial. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, from the digital forensics team that had been examining the Allwine's electronic devices as part of the standard investigation protocol. Detective Scott Wohlers, who specialized in computer crimes and digital evidence, had taken possession of the family's laptops, tablets, and phones, planning to look for any correspondence that might shed light on Amy's state of mind or reveal problems in the marriage. What he found instead was a trail that led into the darkest corners of the internet and exposed a conspiracy so calculated that it seemed almost fictional. On Stephen's personal laptop, Wohlers discovered evidence of Tor browser usage, the software that allows access to the dark web where users can browse anonymously, where illegal markets thrive and terrible transactions occur beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Stephen had been careful, deleting his browsing history, wiping files, taking steps to cover his digital tracks. But he wasn't careful enough, because digital forensics has evolved to the point where deletion rarely means permanent erasure. Wohlers used specialized recovery software and found fragments, pieces of data that Stephen thought he'd eliminated, breadcrumbs that led to a website called Besa Mafia. The discovery of Stephen's activity on Besa Mafia was the moment the investigation shifted from suspicious death to premeditated murder conspiracy. Besa Mafia presented itself as a professional murder-for-hire service, complete with a slick interface, customer service representatives who communicated through encrypted messaging, and a payment system based on Bitcoin that promised anonymity for clients. The site had been operating for several months in 2016, attracting people from around the world who wanted someone dead and were willing to pay for it. Stephen Allwine had created an account in late May 2016, just 6 months before Amy's death, using the username Dog Day God, a reference that would later be analyzed for its religious overtones and possible psychological significance. The messages he'd sent through the site were recovered through a combination of forensic analysis and cooperation with cybersecurity researchers who had been tracking Besa Mafia's activities. What those messages revealed was chilling in their specificity and cold calculation. Stephen's first message to Besa Mafia laid out his desires with business-like efficiency. He wanted his wife killed, and he wanted it to look like an accident or a random act of violence, something that wouldn't raise suspicion or point back to him. He provided Amy's full name, her photograph, her work address at the financial services company in downtown St. Paul, where she worked as an IT specialist. He detailed her routine, the route she took to work, the parking ramp where she left her car, the time she typically arrived and departed. He described her as a creature of habit, someone whose movements could be predicted, someone vulnerable in specific windows of time. The level of detail was disturbing. Each piece of information a betrayal, a husband cataloging his wife's vulnerabilities and packaging them for someone he believed would use that information to end her life. He suggested methods, scenarios that might work. Perhaps a carjacking gone wrong, perhaps an assault in the parking ramp, perhaps something that looked like a break-in at their home. He was flexible, he indicated, willing to let the professionals decide the best approach. The payment records were equally damning. Bitcoin transactions, the cryptocurrency that had become the preferred payment method for dark web transactions because of its perceived anonymity, showed Stephen transferring thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoin to Besa Mafia's wallet addresses. An initial payment of approximately $6,000 to open the contract. Additional payments totaling another $6,000 to expedite the job, to move his order up in the queue, to ensure priority service. He'd acquired the Bitcoin through various exchanges, taking careful steps to obscure the source of the funds, but the trail was still recoverable for investigators who knew how to follow cryptocurrency transactions through blockchain analysis. Stephen Allwine, the church elder who preached about morality and righteousness, had spent over $12,000 trying to have his wife murdered, and he'd done it while sitting in his home office, while Amy was in the next room, while their son played video games downstairs while maintaining his facade of normalcy. The messages between Stephen and the Besa Mafia administrators showed his growing frustration as weeks passed without the hit being carried out. He sent inquiries asking for updates, wanting to know when the job would be completed, expressing concern that too much time was passing. The responses he received were vague and non-committal, promising action soon, asking for patience, requesting additional payments to cover expenses. What Stephen didn't know, what investigators would later learn through a complex international investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, was that Besa Mafia was almost certainly a scam operation. The site collected payments from would-be murderers but never actually carried out hits, simply stringing clients along with promises and excuses while pocketing Bitcoin. The site's administrator, who would eventually be identified and arrested in Europe, had no actual connections to Albanian organized crime or professional hitmen. It was a con, exploiting people's murderous intent for financial gain without actually committing the murders. But Stephen's intent was real. His desire to have Amy killed was documented in his own words, and his willingness to pay proved his commitment to seeing his wife dead. When the hitman never materialized, when Amy continued living her normal life completely unaware that her husband had taken out a contract on her, Stephen made the decision that would ultimately lead to his arrest and conviction. If Besa Mafia wouldn't kill Amy, he'd do it himself. The digital forensics team found evidence of extensive research Stephen had conducted in the months leading up to Amy's death. Searches for information about staging suicide scenes, websites about gunshot wounds and how to make them look self-inflicted, forums where people discussed ways to kill without getting caught. He'd researched scopolamine, learning about its effects, how it could incapacitate someone, make them compliant and confused, rob them of the ability to fight back or remember what was happening. He'd found sources, possibly through dark web markets, and acquired the drug. He purchased the Ruger 9mm, the gun that would kill Amy, going through legal channels at a gun store and passing the background check because he had no criminal record, nothing that would flag him as dangerous. The affair that had been Stephen's motivation for wanting Amy dead came to light through witness interviews and additional digital forensics. Stephen had been involved with another woman for over a year, conducting the relationship with the same careful compartmentalization he brought to everything else in his double life. The woman, whose identity was protected during the investigation and trial, had apparently believed Stephen's marriage was troubled and ending, that divorce was imminent, that they'd be together openly once he'd extricated himself from his marital situation. She may not have known the full extent of Stephen's plans, may not have been aware that he moved beyond thoughts of divorce to actively trying to have Amy killed. When investigators interviewed her, she was shocked and horrified, realizing she'd been involved with a man capable of murder, that her existence had been part of his motivation for wanting his wife dead. The betrayal Amy had suffered was layered and complete. Her husband not just unfaithful, but actively plotting her death so he could be with someone else while maintaining his reputation and avoiding the social and religious consequences of divorce. The financial analysis revealed additional motives beyond the affair. Amy had life insurance, policies that would pay out substantial sums to Stephen as the beneficiary if she died. While not enough to make him wealthy, it was enough to provide financial cushion to pay off debts, to start fresh with his mistress without the financial complications of divorce proceedings and asset division. Stephen had also been having money problems that he'd hidden from Amy, credit card debt and poor investments that had put strain on their finances. Amy's death would solve multiple problems simultaneously, at least in Stephen's calculating mind. He'd be free to pursue his relationship. He'd avoid the shame of divorce. He'd collect insurance money, and he'd maintain his standing as a grieving widower, worthy of sympathy and support from his church community. The timeline investigators reconstructed of that final Sunday was heartbreaking in its cold methodology. Amy had attended church that morning with no idea it would be her last day alive. She'd smiled at friends, participated in worship, probably looked forward to the week ahead. Stephen had gone through the motions, playing his role as elder and husband, waiting for the hours to pass until he could execute his plan. After they returned home, sometime in the early afternoon while their son was at youth group activities, Stephen had drugged Amy with the scopolamine. The drug would have made her confused, disoriented, unable to effectively resist or understand what was happening. In that vulnerable state, Stephen had shot her once in the head with the Ruger. He'd arranged the scene, placing the gun near her hand, positioning her body, creating the suicide narrative. He'd cleaned up, changed clothes if necessary, composed himself. Then he'd driven to the church to pick up their son, a calculated move to establish his alibi and create separation between himself and the time of death. He'd returned home with his son, sent the boy to another part of the house, and then discovered Amy's body, placing that 911 call with manufactured panic in his voice. The evidence against Stephen Allwine was overwhelming and multifaceted, the digital trail showing his attempts to hire a hitman, the Bitcoin payments proving his financial commitment to having Amy killed, the scopolamine in her system proving she'd been drugged, the forensic evidence showing the gunshot wound was inconsistent with suicide, the affair providing clear motive, the life insurance policies adding financial incentive, the timeline showing his opportunity, and underlying all of it, the sheer coldness required to plan your wife's murder while sitting beside her in church, while eating dinner across from her, while raising a child together. Detective McAleer and his team built a case that was virtually airtight, each piece of evidence reinforcing the others, creating a web of proof that Stephen's defense attorneys would struggle to penetrate. The arrest came on January 17, 2017, just over 2 months after Amy's death. Stephen Allwine was taken into custody at his home, the same house where he'd murdered his wife, where their son had been living in the aftermath of tragedy with his father, the man who'd taken his mother from him. The charges were first-degree premeditated murder, the most serious homicide charge possible, carrying a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. When detectives informed Stephen he was under arrest, when they read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs, he maintained his innocence, claimed he'd loved Amy, insisted this was all a terrible mistake. But his protests rang hollow against the mountain of evidence that told a different story, a story of betrayal and calculation and murder dressed up as faith and devotion. The community that had trusted him, the church that had elevated him to leadership, the family that had welcomed him, All of them were about to learn the truth about Stephen Allwine, and that truth would shatter everything they thought they knew about the man who'd stood at the pulpit and preached about love. The news of Stephen Allwine's arrest hit Cottage Grove and the United Brethren church community like a shockwave, the kind of revelation that makes people question everything they thought they knew about reality, about trust, about their own judgment. Within hours of the arrest being made public, phones across the Twin Cities area were ringing constantly, text messages flooding in, social media exploding with disbelief and horror. Stephen Allwine, the church elder who'd led Bible studies and organized mission trips, who'd counseled troubled marriages and prayed with people in crisis, who'd stood at Amy's funeral just 2 months earlier with tears streaming down his face, was being charged with her murder. Not just her murder, but a premeditated conspiracy involving the dark web and murder for hire plots and a level of deception so complete that it seemed impossible. People who'd known Stephen for years, who'd trusted him with their spiritual lives, who'd invited him into their homes and shared their deepest struggles with him, felt a betrayal that went beyond personal. It was existential. If Stephen Allwine could be a murderer, if evil could hide so completely behind a mask of righteousness, then how could anyone be trusted? How could you ever really know what darkness lurked behind a friendly smile and a firm handshake? The church leadership held an emergency meeting the day after Stephen's arrest. Pastors and elders gathering in the same fellowship hall where Stephen had served communion and led prayers, trying to process what felt like a collective trauma. Some people couldn't accept it, insisted there had to be a mistake, that the evidence must be wrong or manufactured, that Stephen would be exonerated once the truth came out. Others felt a creeping sense of guilt, wondering if they'd missed signs, if there had been red flags they'd ignored or dismissed, if they could have somehow prevented Amy's death by being more observant or asking harder questions. The pastor, a man who'd known Stephen for over a decade, who'd presided over his marriage to Amy, who'd baptized their adopted son, stood before the congregation that Sunday and tried to find words adequate to the moment. He talked about the mystery of evil, about how sin can corrupt even those who seem most devoted, about the importance of continuing to support Amy's family and especially her son, who'd now lost both parents to this unthinkable tragedy. But words felt insufficient, hollow against the magnitude of what had been revealed. Amy's family was navigating their own private hell, grief compounded by betrayal in ways that most people couldn't fathom. Her siblings, her extended family, the people who'd known her since childhood and loved her deeply, were trying to process not just her violent death, but the fact that the man they'd welcomed as family, who'd sat at their holiday tables and been part of their celebrations, had been plotting to kill her for months. They thought about all the times Stephen had looked them in the eye, had hugged them, had expressed love for Amy, and now every memory was poisoned, every interaction recontextualized through the lens of his guilt. Amy's sister would later say in a victim impact statement that the hardest part wasn't just losing Amy, though that was devastating enough, but losing all the memories too, having every photo and every holiday and every family gathering tainted by the knowledge that Stephen had been lying, pretending. Planning murder while smiling for pictures. The theft wasn't just Amy's life, but the family's entire history with her, all of it now viewed through a different, darker filter. The custody of Amy and Stephen's son became an immediate concern. A child who'd already lost his mother and now lost his father to prison, who'd been adopted into what should have been a loving, stable home, and instead found himself at the center of a nightmare. Amy's family fought for custody, determined to give the boy some continuity, some connection to his mother's memory and values, some chance at healing from trauma that would mark him for life. The court granted custody to Amy's relatives, and they began the long, difficult process of helping a child understand that his father had killed his mother, that the man who'd coached his soccer team and helped with his homework and tucked him in at night was a murderer. Child psychologists talk about how this kind of trauma reshapes a person's entire understanding of safety and trust, how it creates wounds that therapy can address but never fully heal. This boy would grow up knowing his origin story was marked by violence and betrayal, and the ripple effects of Stephen's actions would extend far beyond the courtroom. The trial of Stephen Allwine began in November 2017, almost exactly 1 year after Amy's murder, and it dominated local news coverage for its entire 3-week duration. The Washington County Courthouse in Stillwater, where the trial was held due to venue concerns, became a focal point for media attention. Camera crews stationed outside, reporters doing stand-ups about the church elder accused of hiring a dark web hitman to kill his wife. The prosecution team, led by Assistant Washington County Attorney Jamie Cruiser, had spent months preparing their case, organizing the mountain of evidence into a narrative that would be clear and compelling to jurors who likely had no understanding of Bitcoin or the dark web or forensic genealogy. They needed to make the complex accessible, to show how the digital breadcrumbs Stephen left behind painted an irrefutable picture of guilt. The opening statement set the tone for what would be a trial heavy on technical evidence but grounded in human tragedy. Crisis stood before the jury and told them about Amy Allwine, showing them photos of a smiling woman with kind eyes, describing her work as an IT professional, her devotion to her son, her active involvement in church and community. Then Crusoe walked them through the dark web plot, explaining how Stephen had spent months trying to have Amy killed, how he provided detailed information to Besa Mafia, how he paid thousands in Bitcoin, how he checked the site obsessively waiting for confirmation that his wife was dead, when the hitman never came, when Besa Mafia failed to deliver on their promises. Stephen took matters into his own hands. He drugged Amy with scopolamine to incapacitate her. He shot her in the head with a Ruger 9mm purchased specifically for this purpose. He staged the scene to look like suicide, and then he called 911, playing the role of devastated husband, a performance he probably rehearsed in his mind dozens of times. The defense attorney, a public defender named Kevin DeVore, who'd been assigned Stephen's case, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the digital trail was clear, and Stephen's own words on Besa Mafia were damning beyond any reasonable explanation. DeVore's strategy focused on raising doubt about the reliability of the digital evidence, suggesting that perhaps someone else had used Stephen's computer, that perhaps the Besa Mafia communications had been fabricated or manipulated, that perhaps the entire dark web angle was a red herring. He argued that Amy's death could still have been suicide, that the scopolamine might have come from some other source, that the medical examiner's conclusions about the gunshot wound weren't as definitive as the prosecution claimed. It was a strategy born of desperation rather than genuine holes in the prosecution's case, and as the trial progressed, it became clear that the jury wasn't buying it. The testimony from digital forensics expert Detective Scott Wohlers was particularly devastating to the defense. Wohlers spent hours on the stand walking the jury through exactly how he'd recovered the deleted files from Stephen's laptop, how he'd traced the Tor browser usage, how he'd connected Stephen to the Dog Day God account on Besa Mafia. He explained Bitcoin in simple terms, showing how the blockchain allowed investigators to follow the money from Stephen's wallet to Besa Mafia's addresses. He displayed the messages Stephen had sent, projected on screens in the courtroom for everyone to see, and the jury could read in Stephen's own words his instructions for killing Amy, his detailed descriptions of her routines, his cold calculations about methods and timing. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretations. Stephen had tried to hire someone to murder his wife, and the evidence was irrefutable. The testimony about the affair provided context for motive, showing the jury that Stephen had strong personal reasons for wanting Amy gone. The woman Stephen had been involved with took the stand reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable being part of this public spectacle, and described their relationship. She maintained that Stephen had told her his marriage was over, that he and Amy were heading for divorce, that he wanted to be with her. She claimed she'd had no knowledge of the murder plot, no idea Stephen was capable of violence, and investigators had found no evidence contradicting her claims. She appeared genuinely shocked and remorseful, realizing she'd been a factor in a man's decision to commit murder, even if she hadn't actively participated in or encouraged it. Her testimony humanized the affair, made it real for the jury, helped them understand what Stephen thought he'd gain by eliminating Amy from his life. The medical examiner's testimony provided the scientific foundation for proving Amy's death was homicide rather than suicide, Dr. Torreside. Michael Medee walked the jury through the autopsy findings, using diagrams and photographs that were difficult to look at but necessary for establishing the truth. He explained how the angle of the bullet trajectory was inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound, how the stippling pattern suggested the gun had been held by someone else, how the position of Amy's body didn't align with what would be expected if she'd shot herself. He discussed the scopolamine found in her blood, explaining that this drug wasn't something Amy would have had access to through legitimate medical channels, that its presence indicated she'd been deliberately drugged, likely to make her unable to resist. The defense tried to create doubt during cross-examination, asking about possibilities and uncertainties, but McGee was unshakable. In his professional opinion, based on decades of experience, Amy Allwine had been murdered, and the physical evidence supported that conclusion beyond any reasonable doubt. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful testimony came from Amy's colleagues and friends, people who'd known her well and could speak to her state of mind in the days and weeks before her death. They described a woman who was happy, engaged with life, making plans for the future, showing no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. She talked about upcoming work projects, about her son's school activities, about holiday plans. She'd been her usual self at church that final Sunday, smiling and chatting with friends, participating fully in worship. Nothing in her behavior suggested someone contemplating suicide, and multiple witnesses testified that Amy had never expressed any thoughts about ending her life, had never seemed hopeless or despairing. The prosecution used this testimony to dismantle any lingering possibility that Amy's death could have been self-inflicted, building a portrait of a woman who had every reason to live and no reason to die. The prosecution's closing argument tied everything together into a narrative of betrayal, calculation, and cold-blooded murder. Kreiser reminded the jury of the evidence they'd seen, the digital trail that led directly to Stephen, the Bitcoin payments that proved his intent, the scopolamine that proved premeditation, the affair that provided motive, the staged suicide scene that showed consciousness of guilt. This wasn't a crime of passion, she emphasized. This wasn't a moment of rage or a tragic accident. This was planned, methodical, and executed with deliberation. Stephen Allwine had spent months trying to have his wife killed. When that failed, he did it himself. And then he tried to cover it up, tried to manipulate the justice system, tried to get away with murder while playing the role of grieving husband. The jury's job, Kreiser told them, was simple. Look at the evidence, follow where it leads, and deliver justice for Amy Allwine, who deserved so much better than how her life ended. The defense's closing argument was brief and half-hearted, DeVore doing his professional duty, but without the conviction that comes from believing in your client's innocence. He asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to question whether the prosecution had really proven every element beyond all uncertainty, but his words lacked power against the weight of evidence. When he sat down, you could feel in the courtroom that everyone knew how this would end. The jury deliberated for just over 8 hours, a relatively short time for a case of this complexity, but the evidence was so overwhelming that lengthy discussion wasn't necessary. When they returned to the courtroom and the foreperson announced the verdict, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, there was a collective exhale in the gallery, a release of tension that had been building throughout the trial. Amy's family members held each other and wept, finally having official confirmation of what they'd known in their hearts, finally seeing some measure of justice for the woman they'd lost. Stephen showed no visible reaction, simply staring straight ahead as his fate was sealed. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later gave Amy's family the opportunity to address Stephen directly, to tell him what his actions had cost them, and their statements were raw and heartbreaking. Amy's sister spoke about the hole Amy's death had left in their family, about holidays that would never feel complete, about a nephew who'd lost his mother and would grow up with trauma that Stephen had inflicted. She looked directly at Stephen and told him that he'd not only killed Amy but had killed their ability to remember her without pain, had poisoned every memory by his betrayal. Amy's brother talked about the anger he felt, the rage at Stephen's selfishness and cowardice, at how he'd hidden behind religion and respectability while planning murder. Other family members and friends spoke, each one adding to a portrait of collective grief and the devastating ripple effects of one man's evil choices. Judge Mary Theobald, who the 500th presided over the trial with patience and fairness, delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of Stephen's crimes. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree premeditated murder in Minnesota. She spoke about the aggravating factors, the betrayal of trust, the planning and premeditation, the attempt to cover up the crime, the complete lack of remorse. Stephen Allwine would die in prison, and Judge Theobald made clear that this was appropriate given what he'd done. As sheriff's deputies led Stephen away in shackles, He maintained the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial, never once looking at Amy's family, never offering any apology or explanation beyond the lies he told investigators. The broader implications of the case extended beyond Stephen's conviction. The investigation into Besa Mafia led to international law enforcement cooperation. FBI agents working with European authorities to track down the site's administrator and shut down the operation. They discovered that Besa Mafia had collected over $1 million in Bitcoin from people around the world trying to hire hitmen, though there was no evidence any of the requested murders had actually been carried out. The administrator was eventually arrested and charged with fraud and extortion, but the site's existence had exposed a dark reality about how technology was enabling murder for hire plots in ways that had been impossible before the dark web. Stephen's case became a teaching example for law enforcement about following digital evidence trails, about the importance of cryptocurrency analysis, about how deletion doesn't mean evidence is truly gone. For the United Brethren Church community, the healing process was long and painful. Some members left, unable to reconcile their faith with how someone in leadership could have harbored such evil. Others stayed and worked to rebuild trust and community in the aftermath of betrayal. They established a scholarship fund in Amy's name for students pursuing education in technology fields, a way to honor her professional legacy and her love of learning. They supported Amy's son through his trauma, the church community rallying to provide stability and love for a child who'd lost everything. And they grappled with difficult questions about how to prevent future abuse of trust, about what red flags might have been missed, about the nature of evil and how it can disguise itself. Amy's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. The Clara Hoffman Memorial Foundation, established after another Minnesota murder case solved through forensic genealogy, partnered with Amy's family to create resources for solving cold cases through advanced DNA analysis and digital forensics. Amy's technical skills and her tragic death at the hands of someone using dark web technology created a strange symmetry, her case helping advance the very investigative techniques that might prevent or solve future crimes. Her son, raised by Amy's family with love and therapy and support, carries her memory forward, growing up knowing his mother was a good person who deserved better, that her life had meaning beyond how it ended. Stephen Allwine sits in a Minnesota maximum security prison serving his life sentence, and those who've interacted with him say he maintains his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He's filed appeals that have been uniformly rejected, the evidence too strong and the trial too fairly conducted to offer any grounds for overturning his conviction. He receives no visitors, his family having long since cut ties with him, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the murderer the evidence proved him to be. He'll die in prison, and his legacy will be defined entirely by his worst act, by the betrayal of Amy and the violence he inflicted on someone who trusted him completely. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know. And if you found this story compelling, there are dozens of other cases on this channel that deserve your attention, stories of victims who deserve to be remembered, and justice that sometimes takes years but eventually arrives. The case of Amy Allwine reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs, that the people we trust most can harbor the darkest intentions, and that technology is a double-edged sword, enabling both crime and the investigations that solve them. Amy was an IT professional who understood technology, and in the end it was digital evidence that brought her killer to justice, her own husband who tried to use the dark web to escape consequences, but left a trail that competent investigators could follow straight to the truth. She fought back not just in her final moments, but through the evidence she left behind, through the life she'd lived that made suicide implausible, through the community that loved her and demanded answers. Her death was a tragedy, but her case became a testament to persistence and justice, to the idea that even the most carefully planned murders can be solved when determination meets expertise, when technology is used to expose rather than conceal. Stephen Allwine thought he could get away with murder by hiding behind church leadership and dark web anonymity, but Amy's story proved him wrong, and she has the last word, spoken through the evidence that put her killer behind bars for life.